Picture this. You're standing in the royal chambers of Madrid's Alcazar Palace on November 6th, 1665, and you're witnessing something that will haunt you for the rest of your life. The most powerful woman in Europe, Queen Mariana of Austria, has just given birth to what should be the future King of Spain. But the screams echoing through these marble halls aren't cries of joy. They're sounds of absolute horror. The thing lying in the silk-lined cradle barely resembles a human child. Its jaw juts out so grotesquely that its mouth cannot close, drool pooling on the expensive linens. Its tongue hangs limp and oversized, making speech impossible. Its limbs are twisted at unnatural angles, and when the court physicians examine the infant, they discover deformities so severe that many cross themselves and whisper prayers. This creature, this mockery of royal bloodline, is Charles II of Spain, and his story represents the most devastating consequence of a family tradition so twisted, so fundamentally wrong, that it would ultimately destroy the most powerful dynasty in European history. What you're about to hear isn't just the tale of one deformed king, but the systematic self-destruction of an entire bloodline through generations of deliberate incest, brother-sister marriages, and uncle-niece unions that turned royal palaces into genetic laboratories of horror. Before diving into these forgotten stories of familial abuse and generational trauma, if you enjoy learning about the dark truths hidden behind royal glamour, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these disturbing family secrets together, from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the price of absolute power. The name Charles II might not be familiar to you, but his twisted face and broken body tell a story that will change how you think about royal families forever. This isn't just another tale of medieval cruelty. It's the scientific proof of what happens when human beings treat their own children like breeding stock, when family trees become family circles, and when the pursuit of pure bloodlines leads to the purest form of genetic nightmare. Let's start with the man who would unwittingly become the architect of this generational horror story. His name was Maximilian I, and in 1477, he made a decision that seemed brilliant at the time, but would echo through the centuries like a curse spoken by the gods themselves. Maximilian understood something that would define Habsburg strategy for the next 300 years. Let others wage war, but you, happy Austria, marry. This wasn't just a political slogan. It was a blueprint for dynastic domination through strategic matrimony. But Maximilian had no idea what monster he was creating when he began the Habsburg tradition of keeping marriages within the family to preserve power and wealth. What started as occasional cousin marriages would evolve into a systematic program of incest, so pervasive that Habsburg family trees began to look like circles, with the same names appearing over and over again in different generations, not just as relatives, but as both ancestors and descendants of the same individuals. The early Habsburg marriages seemed successful enough to justify the strategy. When Maximilian's son Philip married Joanna of Castile, they gained control of Spain and its vast American territories. When their children married within the extended Habsburg network, they consolidated power across Europe from Vienna to Madrid, from the Netherlands to Sicily. By the 16th century, the Habsburgs ruled an empire so vast that it was said the sun never set on their territories. But success bred obsession, and obsession bred a dangerous delusion. The Habsburgs began to believe that their bloodline was literally divine, that mixing it with inferior noble families would dilute their God-given right to rule. What had started as pragmatic politics became religious conviction. They weren't just preserving their dynasty, they were preserving the pure essence of royal authority itself. The first generation of close Habsburg intermarriage produced children who were merely eccentric. The famous Habsburg jaw, a protruding lower mandible that made normal eating and speaking difficult, began to appear, but it was considered a mark of noble breeding rather than genetic defect. When Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, married his first cousin Isabella of Portugal in 1526, their children showed only mild abnormalities that could be explained away as aristocratic refinement. But genetics doesn't forgive, and it doesn't forget. Each generation of Habsburg inbreeding was depositing genetic damage, like interest in a bank account that would eventually come due with devastating compound effects. The recessive genes that cause physical and mental abnormalities were being concentrated rather than diluted, creating a genetic time bomb that was ticking toward an inevitable explosion. Philip II of Spain, Charles V's son, inherited both his father's empire and his growing obsession with bloodline purity. When Philip married his first cousin, Maria Manuela of Portugal, he was following family tradition. When she died in childbirth, he married another relative. When political necessity forced him to marry outside the family twice, he quickly returned to Habsburg custom by arranging for his children to marry their own relatives in an endless cycle of genetic reinforcement. The psychological impact of this systematic inbreeding on the Habsburg family members themselves was devastating in ways that court historians were forbidden to record. Imagine growing up knowing that your only marriage prospects were your own siblings, cousins, aunts, or uncles. Picture the family dinners where future spouses evaluated each other not as potential partners, but as breeding stock. Consider the children who watched their parents' obviously dysfunctional relationships and realized they were destined for the same fate. Philip II's son, also named Philip, married his first cousin Anna of Austria in 1570, and their children began showing more pronounced abnormalities. The Habsburg jaw became more prominent, but more troubling were the mental symptoms that courtiers whispered about in private. Philip III, their son, showed signs of what modern psychiatrists would recognize as severe developmental delays and emotional instability. By now, the Habsburg family tree had become a geometric impossibility. The same individuals appeared in multiple relationships to each other, simultaneously cousins, aunts, uncles, and grandparents in different branches. When genealogists tried to map the relationships, they discovered that the supposedly diverse royal bloodline had been reduced to the genetic equivalent of a single family reproducing with itself across multiple generations. The court physicians began noticing patterns that terrified them, but that they dared not discuss openly. Habsburg children were increasingly likely to be born with physical deformities, learning disabilities, and what they termed melancholic dispositions, severe depression and emotional instability that made normal relationships impossible. But speaking about royal genetic defects was treason, so these observations were buried in coded medical reports that wouldn't be fully understood until centuries later. Philip III's marriage to his cousin Margaret of Austria in 1599 produced children who represented a new level of Habsburg dysfunction. Their son, the future Philip IV, was born with the characteristic jaw deformity so severe that he couldn't chew solid food properly and spoke with a lisp that made him difficult to understand. But more concerning were his psychological symptoms: extreme paranoia, violent mood swings, and what court observers described as an inability to form normal emotional attachments. The Habsburg obsession with genetic purity had created exactly the opposite of what they sought. Instead of preserving royal perfection, they were systematically destroying it, generation by generation, marriage by marriage, child by child. But the family was so committed to their ideology of bloodline supremacy that they interpreted each new deformity as a test from God rather than evidence of their fundamental error. Philip IV's marriage to his niece, Mariana of Austria, in 1649 represented the culmination of Habsburg inbreeding strategy. Mariana was simultaneously Philip's niece, his cousin, and his second cousin through multiple family lines. The genetic mathematics of their union were so complex that modern geneticists calculate their children had less genetic diversity than the offspring of full siblings in most other families. The preparation for this marriage reveals the twisted psychology that inbreeding had created within the Habsburg family itself. Mariana was raised from childhood with the explicit understanding that she would marry her uncle. Court records describe family gatherings where the future spouses interacted with the uncomfortable awareness of their predetermined relationship. Philip, already in his 40s and showing severe signs of physical and mental deterioration, waited for his teenage niece to reach marriageable age like a spider watching a fly grow fat enough to consume. When the marriage finally took place, court observers noted the obvious discomfort of both participants. Mariana, barely 16, had been educated to see incest as royal duty. But her letters to confidants reveal a young woman struggling with revulsion toward both her husband and her fate. Philip, meanwhile, was dealing with his own psychological demons, the accumulated trauma of a lifetime spent in relationships that violated every natural human instinct. Their first child, a daughter named Margaret Theresa, was born in 1651 with relatively minor abnormalities, giving the family false hope that their breeding program might still produce viable heirs. But their subsequent children told a different story. Prince Philip Prospero, born in 1657, lived only 4 years, his short life marked by constant illness and developmental delays that made normal childhood impossible. The court physicians assigned to care for these Habsburg children were witnessing something unprecedented in royal medicine. They were watching the real-time genetic collapse of a family line, the biological consequences of treating human reproduction like livestock breeding. But they couldn't speak openly about what they saw, couldn't warn the family about the path they were following, couldn't prevent the approaching catastrophe that their medical knowledge told them was inevitable. Then came Charles, and everything changed. Born on November 6th, 1665, Charles II represented the mathematical endpoint of Habsburg inbreeding, a child so genetically compromised that his very existence proved the fundamental impossibility of his family's eugenic philosophy. Modern geneticists who have studied the Habsburg family tree calculate that Charles had virtually no genetic diversity at all, with a coefficient of inbreeding higher than that typically seen in laboratory animals bred specifically for genetic uniformity. The physical deformities that marked Charles from birth were so severe that court physicians initially doubted he would survive infancy. The Habsburg jaw had evolved into something that barely allowed him to eat. His tongue was so enlarged that speech was nearly impossible, and his limbs showed the kind of asymmetrical development that suggested profound neurological damage. But these obvious abnormalities were just the visible symptoms of much deeper genetic chaos. Charles's childhood was a daily horror show of medical interventions and failed treatments. Palace records describe a boy who couldn't walk until age 8, couldn't speak coherently until his teens, and never developed the kind of emotional responses that would allow normal human relationships. He was prone to seizures that court physicians treated with everything from bloodletting to exorcism, depending on whether they viewed his condition as medical or supernatural. But perhaps most tragically, Charles was intelligent enough to understand his own condition. Court observers noted that he would spend hours staring at portraits of his ancestors, apparently trying to understand how the handsome, vital kings and queens of previous generations had produced something like himself. He seemed to grasp that he was the end result of some terrible family tradition, the final product of a system that had consumed everyone he was related to. The psychological impact of this realization on a child already struggling with severe physical disabilities was devastating. Charles developed what modern psychologists would recognize as severe depression and anxiety, but his emotional problems were compounded by the impossible expectations placed on him as the heir to the Spanish throne. He was simultaneously the most important person in his empire and the least capable of fulfilling his responsibilities. As Charles reached marriageable age, the Habsburg family faced an unprecedented crisis. Their traditional solution to succession problems, marrying within the family to produce new heirs, was clearly impossible. Charles was so severely disabled that normal marriage seemed unlikely, and even if he could reproduce, the genetic mathematics made it virtually certain that his children would be even more damaged than he was. But royal necessity demanded that Charles marry and attempt to produce an heir, regardless of the consequences. The first bride selected for him was Marie-Louise of Orléans, a French princess chosen specifically because she was not related to the Habsburg family and might therefore introduce some genetic diversity into the bloodline. The irony was bitter. After centuries of avoiding outside marriages to preserve bloodline purity, the Habsburgs were finally forced to seek foreign genes to save their dynasty. The wedding of Charles and Marie Louise in 1679 was a spectacle that masked the tragedy beneath royal ceremony. Observers described a bride who could barely conceal her revulsion at her husband's appearance, and a groom who seemed confused by the basic expectations of marriage. The marriage was consummated, but court physicians reported that the physical and psychological challenges were so severe that normal intimate relations were essentially impossible. Marie-Louise's letters to her family in France provide a heartbreaking window into the reality of marriage to a man whose genetic damage made normal human connection impossible. She described Charles as kind but childlike, physically repulsive but emotionally needy, simultaneously the most powerful person in Europe and the most helpless man she had ever encountered. Her attempts to fulfill her royal duty while maintaining her own sanity created a psychological burden that would eventually break her completely. For 10 years, Marie-Louise struggled to produce an heir, with a husband whose genetic condition made reproduction unlikely at best. Court physicians monitored every aspect of their intimate life, providing medical advice and interventions that bordered on torture for both participants. The pressure from the Habsburg family, the Spanish court, and the entire European political system created an atmosphere where the couple's private failures became matters of international concern. The psychological toll on Charles during this period was devastating. Palace servants reported that he would spend entire days weeping, apparently overwhelmed by his inability to fulfill the most basic royal duty of producing an heir. His seizures became more frequent and severe, possibly triggered by the stress of his impossible situation. Court physicians noted that he began showing signs of what they termed profound melancholia, a withdrawal from reality so complete that he sometimes seemed unaware of his surroundings. Marie-Louise's death in 1689, possibly from poisoning, but more likely from the accumulated stress of her impossible marriage, left Charles more isolated and desperate than ever. At age 24, he had already failed at the most fundamental requirement of kingship, and his family's genetic legacy seemed destined to end with him. But royal protocol demanded that he remarry and try again, regardless of the obvious futility of the effort. His second wife, Mariana of Neuburg, was selected using the same criteria as the first: genetic distance from the Habsburg family and youth enough to maximize reproductive potential. But by this time, Charles's condition had deteriorated so significantly that even the pretense of normal marriage became increasingly difficult to maintain. Court observers noted that the king seemed confused by basic social interactions and often appeared unaware of his wife's presence even when they were in the same room. The second marriage proved even more tragic than the first. Mariana arrived in Madrid with hopes of fulfilling her royal duty and perhaps even finding some happiness with her husband, but she quickly discovered that Charles's genetic damage had progressed beyond the possibility of normal human relationships. Palace records describe a woman who spent increasing amounts of time in prayer, apparently seeking divine intervention for a situation that medical science could not address. Charles's final years represented the complete collapse of the Habsburg genetic experiment. Palace physicians noted that his seizures had become so frequent and severe that he was essentially incapacitated for days at a time. His physical deformities continued to worsen as he aged. His speech became even more difficult to understand, and his emotional responses became so erratic that courtiers never knew whether they would encounter a childlike monarch seeking comfort or a confused tyrant issuing impossible commands. The international implications of Charles's condition became increasingly obvious as European powers began positioning themselves for the inevitable Spanish succession crisis. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their governments about the king's obvious incapacity, and military planners began preparing for the wars that would inevitably follow his death. The Habsburg genetic collapse had become a matter of international security, with the fate of European civilization hanging on the biological failure of a single inbred family. When Charles II finally died on November 1st, 1700, at the age of 38, he took with him the Spanish Habsburg dynasty and proved beyond doubt the ultimate consequences of systematic incest. The autopsy, conducted in secret but preserved in palace archives, revealed the full extent of the genetic damage that centuries of inbreeding had inflicted on his family line. His internal organs were described as putrefied, his brain was noted to be the size of a child's, and his reproductive organs were so underdeveloped that normal procreation would have been impossible even if he had found a willing partner. But the autopsy also revealed something else that speaks to the profound cruelty of the Habsburg inbreeding system. Despite his severe physical and mental disabilities, Charles had lived for 38 years in a state of constant awareness of his own inadequacy. Palace physicians noted evidence of chronic stress and depression so severe that had literally shaped his physical development. The boy who had been born to rule an empire had instead spent his entire life as a prisoner of his own genetic destiny. The War of Spanish Succession that followed Charles's death consumed Europe for over a decade, killing hundreds of thousands of people and reshaping the continental balance of power. The direct cause of this massive conflict was the biological failure of a family that had spent centuries sacrificing human nature to political ambition. The Habsburg obsession with genetic purity had not only destroyed their own bloodline, but had destabilized the entire European political system. Modern genetic analysis of the Habsburg family tree reveals the scientific precision of their self-destruction. By the time Charles II was born, the family had achieved a level of inbreeding that was mathematically impossible to sustain. His coefficient of inbreeding was higher than that of children born to full siblings, and his genetic diversity was so limited that he was essentially the product of a single ancestral couple reproducing with themselves across multiple generations. The Habsburg case study has become a cornerstone of modern genetics education, proving beyond doubt the biological impossibility of maintaining human bloodlines through systematic incest. What the family thought was genetic purification was actually genetic annihilation, a slow-motion suicide that took 2 centuries to complete, but was inevitable from the moment they decided that political power was more important than biological reality. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the Habsburg story is how it was repeated by other royal families who learned nothing from their example. The British royal family, the Russian Romanovs, and dozens of smaller European dynasties continued practicing various forms of inbreeding well into the 20th century, creating their own genetic disasters and human tragedies in pursuit of the same impossible dream of bloodline purity. The children born into these systems were victims of crimes they couldn't understand, prisoners of genetic destinies they had no role in creating. Charles II spent his entire life paying the price for decisions made by ancestors he never met, suffering the consequences of a family ideology that treated human beings like livestock and children like political commodities. Today, as we look back on the Habsburg genetic catastrophe, we can see it as more than just a historical curiosity. It's a warning about what happens when ideology becomes more important than humanity, when political systems prioritize abstract concepts over the welfare of actual people, and when families treat their children as tools rather than individuals deserving of love and protection. The marble halls of the Spanish royal palace still echo with the cries of Charles II, the final victim of a genetic experiment that consumed everyone it touched. His twisted face and broken body stand as permanent testimony to the price of treating human reproduction like a business transaction, family relationships like political alliances, and children like investments in dynastic futures. The Habsburg curse wasn't supernatural. It was scientific, mathematical, and completely predictable. But knowing the science doesn't diminish the human tragedy of families that sacrifice generation after generation of their own children to maintain power and status. Charles II died as he had lived, alone, in pain, and paying the price for crimes committed by people who claimed to love him, but treated him like property. In the end, the Habsburg experiment in genetic purity proved only one thing: that families who treat their children like breeding stock will eventually breed themselves out of existence, leaving behind nothing but cautionary tales and empty palaces haunted by the ghosts of victims who deserve better than the biological destiny their relatives chose for them.